The deal is done. The votes are in. You may still be in line to vote in California, which entitles you to vote, but the polls are officially closed. The ballots are officially cast. I'm Pat Morrison in the LA Times newsroom, and we're going to be able to start looking, instead of back at the campaign that was run, ahead to the numbers and what they're going to signify for Governor Gavin Newsom, whether he will be recalled. If so, who the new governor of California will be and what that means for all of us. Joining me to talk about this is, I think we have John Myers, is that right?
Yes.
John Myers, there we are. John Myers is the Iron Man, seeing us all the way through every single election, the Sacramento bureau chief for the LA Times. So John, obviously we get numbers first. Are there any numbers coming from the Secretary of State or the state office of the votes that have already been cast, that have been counted before the polls closed?
Yeah, there are, and I'm not even going to try to kind of figure out which ones they were, because I kind of just glanced at it before we started talking about it. It's a very small number right now. We generally will see, I mean, in most elections, we'll see a relatively large dump of numbers around the 8:30 time frame in that second half hour of the 8 o'clock hour. But, you know, one of the interesting things, Pat, is that a lot of people voted early this time, and those votes have been processed and they weren't tabulated until the polls closed, so you don't hit the button to get the total. But I think we may get totals a little bit earlier. For instance, some of the first numbers were coming out of Napa County, and it was almost the entire percentage of what Napa County was estimating.
100%?
And that was very strongly for Newsom. So,
got it. And of course, over the course of the night, as we know, these numbers are going to be swinging depending on what constituency they're from, as the in-person voters, what part of California they may be from, and the results will differ and they'll get added up into the overall total. CNN, John, had an exit poll of California voters saying 63% who voted had a negative view of the GOP, and that that a number of the independent voters was up this time. Turnout was way up. And what would that signal for Gavin Newsom and for the people who are challenging him?
well, in terms of the divide of Democrats versus Republicans versus independent voters, who we call no party preference, the exit poll number might have been the first batch. There might be more. The general ballots we've seen collected have suggested that Democrats are outperforming their relative size of the registered electorate. But that number you referenced, that one caught my eye too, about the positive versus negative view of the Republican Party, and more than 6 in 10 saying they had a negative view. If you're Gavin Newsom, that's a good number. And if you're any of the Republican candidates tonight, that's a bad number, because it's hard to see how you have a negative view of the Republican Party, but you have candidate after candidate, including the leading replacement candidate, talk show host Larry Elder, staunchly backing Republican Party platform, staunchly backing former President Trump in lots of ways. So it's really hard to see the recall passing if that exit poll number about popularity or lack of popularity of Republicans is accurate.
In that sense, it's a repeat of 2020, when you saw Republican candidates throughout California, state, local candidates, were doubling down. Instead of trying to distance themselves necessarily from Donald Trump, they were doubling down in identifying with Donald Trump, and of course paid for that at the polls.
Yeah, and one of the things that's interesting for people to watch as they go through the night, depending on how much of a political election returns junkie you are, is a 60-40 split in votes to keep Newsom, votes to recall Newsom. Now, the reason I talk about 60-40 is when Newsom won the governorship in 2018, he won 62-38 over John Cox. It was a lopsided victory, the most lopsided victory in modern California history. But if there's a 60-40 split here in these votes, it's almost as though the electorate, different voters in some places, and maybe not as many voters, but the electorate has split along the same lines that it did when Newsom was elected. Now, it may not hold, but some of those early, we talk about the popularity of the Republican Party. That was almost a 60-40 split kind of thing. 60-40 is an interesting number. A lot of Newsom advisors and people have told me they think they could have a shot at winning 60% of the vote. So to me, anything under that, relatively speaking, Newsom might have underperformed where he was in 2018. But that's kind of the split I'm interested in, whether or not Newsom can get close to that 60% support and push back and defeat the recall.
One of the things we discussed earlier this evening with our colleagues Mark Barabak and Tara Luna was the idea of what the numbers of victory, large or small, but especially large for Gavin Newsom, would mean in terms of him taking this as an affirmation of his policies and practices rather than just a repudiation of candidates who were too Trumpian for the voters' tastes?
It's a really interesting question, and I think a lot of us are going to be watching that. Those of us who cover politics for the Times, because if you look at this campaign, this wasn't a campaign that the governor's supporters ran about. Here's why Gavin Newsom is good. Here's why you should keep Gavin Newsom. It was a campaign that said, "Don't get rid of him, or all hell will break loose in California." I mean, it was really an apocalyptic kind of campaign, warning about a Larry Elder as governor or any other Republican in terms of vaccines and vaccine mandates and vaccine requirements. So I don't know that you can look at the results and determine that people really liked Gavin Newsom. They might have really liked Democratic Party priorities, but I think that's going to be one of those things that people are going to bounce back and forth on a little bit. Regardless of it, if Newsom is successful, then the outcome is what he wants, and he continues to govern, and he will be a dominant force again for re-election in 2022, I expect. But it's really interesting that this campaign has not been an affirmation of Newsom. It has all been about the Republican boogeyman. The only people talking about Gavin Newsom, of course, were the Republicans.
There is no down ballot on this, but there is sort of down ballot effect, I would think, whether other Republicans are in the state feel dejected by this, feel defeated by this, feel that it's time to move maybe a little back toward the center again, and whether Democrats feel emboldened to move to the left.
Yeah, you have to wonder if the recall is unsuccessful. And again, huge caveats. We're just seeing numbers. The recall is behind in early numbers, but that doesn't necessarily mean how the outcome's going to be. But if the recall is unsuccessful tonight, and you're one of those Republicans who is thinking about running for one of the 8 statewide offices, we elect 8 statewide officers in California. Do you really want to run next year if the brand of your Republican Party is thought of that poorly? And of course, this isn't a new phenomenon in California. The Republican Party's been struggling with its brand identification now for the better part of 2 decades, almost, certainly a decade and a half. So I think that is challenging for anybody who's running statewide next year with an R next to their name. It could be challenging in congressional seats. We're probably going to have some hot congressional races that we don't know what those maps are going to look like. They're being redrawn after the census. But I think you make an interesting point, which is that if you are a Republican running in 2022 and this recall goes down, and it goes down in part because people don't have a good impression of the Republican Party, you got to be a little bit worried, I would think.
We were just talking with Ben Welsh, who's the LA Times numbers guy, and we're directing people to go to the LA Times website where they can refresh as often as they like or get auto-refreshed with numbers. And here are some. The first LA Times results to come in: 30% to remove Gavin Newsom, 69% to keep him. This is with 40% of the expected vote being counted already. So that margin you were talking about, John, that's a pretty large margin. It's doubtful it will sustain, given the demographics of the votes that would remain to be counted and the possibility of an in-person Republican turnout today on Election Day higher than the number of, or at least higher than expected. But that's a pretty remarkable figure.
It is, but here's what I really find interesting about that, Pat, and that's the first time I've heard him, you telling me just now. Our final poll, which was conducted by UC Berkeley and co-sponsored by the Times, asked, it was in the field, as they call it. People were being surveyed after they had already voted. Some of the people polled had voted, some of the people had not. Of the people who had voted, they told our pollster 70% of them were against the recall and 30% for the recall. So almost the exact number you just quoted, which makes me think that what we are seeing are those ballots of people who had voted several days ago, and they may split 70-30. I believe that the in-person voting tonight, and a lot of people believe this, the in-person voting today is going to be much more favorable to Republicans. So I think that 70-30 number is going to shift. I think that might be a high watermark. I think it's going to get closer. I still kind of think my 60-40 works, so stay with me. Let's see if that happens. But that split that you're talking about, that Ben said in those early numbers, is almost square on what our poll found of early voters. And I suspect that's their ballots that we're now seeing show up.
And as far as the challengers at this point, with those same numbers, Larry Elder leads the replacement candidates with 40% of the vote, which is a pretty substantial percentage among more than 40 candidates. And I'll be interested to see whether where Caitlyn Jenner shows up in this, because our last numbers, John, showed that Caitlyn Jenner was pulling single digits. This was a candidate who led the pack at the outset, mostly because of celebrity status, but who slipped way down, was not able to answer questions of substance about California and governance, and didn't really seem that engaged in campaigning.
Yeah, a campaign that really seemed to be over before it ever began, and felt like more of a cultural talking point than it did real politics. But that Larry Elder number you gave, Pat, 40% in the early vote, again, that's pretty darn close to our final poll, which showed him leading the replacement pack with 38% of the vote. But a really important caveat that I want our viewers and our readers to think about through the night is the number of people voting on the second question, we believe, is going to be substantially smaller than the number of people voting on the first question, whether or not to recall Newsom. And so, in other words, 38% of a smaller number of total voters does not compare to the larger number of voters who are voting on the recall question. I hope I'm not confusing people, but the polling, clearly has shown that a lot of Democrats were skipping the second question. Some other voters were skipping the second question, which makes that replacement election electorate different, maybe more conservative, more Republican, but smaller than the people who are voting on question one. And I think that is one of those dynamics we'll have to continue to watch, so that we give Mr. Elder his due, and if in fact he comes out on top in question two, but that we don't compare it too closely to what the Newsom number is, because I think more people are voting on the first question in this race.
Yeah, it may end up almost being a Republican primary of sorts, if you want to put it that way, even though most of the candidates, a lot of the candidates are not Republicans in that second question. And Governor Newsom had said, and Democratic leaders had said, don't even bother to vote on the second question. But if you have a candidate like Larry Elder, who hews very closely to Donald Trump's position in many things, being the leader in this pack, where you have most of the voters being Republicans or maybe declined to state voters, that's going to be a very telling message for Republicans as they go forward.
Yeah, it was interesting to me as this campaign started to progress that almost all of the leading Republican candidates, who we should name, Larry Elder, we've talked about, former San Diego Mayor Kevin Faulconer, San Diego businessman John Cox, and Assemblyman Kevin Kiley from a Northern California Assembly district, all of them, with the exception of Faulconer, and maybe even Jenner, I'm putting in this category, were running what I felt like was a primary campaign, really only speaking to base Republican voters. Former Mayor Faulconer tried, I thought, to kind of bridge out to voters beyond the Republican base, maybe some independent voters, maybe some disaffected Democrats, but really everyone else was running a Republican primary in a way. And it felt as though what they were doing is either trying to play that base for this election, or assuming if this election was unsuccessful, positioning themselves for 2022. And Larry Elder, by the way, told a talk radio station in Fresno today that he is a dominant force now in California politics, and he's not going anywhere. And I believe that. I think that you could easily see Larry Elder back on this ballot, competing head to head with Gavin Newsom potentially in 2022.
I know you have to work and write and type, not that this isn't working, but I'll leave you with this one question that already in the days past, Larry Elder and others have been saying, well, the election's rigged, we are going to, don't accept the results, there'll be fake, there'll be fraud, laying the kind of groundwork that Donald Trump was doing in the 2020 election. Is this going to register at all? Is it going to go anywhere?
Well, it's going to register with Republican voters, unfortunately. There's no foundation to Mr. Elder's comments. There have been no reports of systemic widespread fraud in this election. There have been no reports of that in California elections in the past. Have there been problems? Yes. Systemic widespread problems? Absolutely not. Mail-in balloting gets criticized by Republicans, but there are a number of safeguards. There are barcodes on the ballots. They track who they go to. They have a process if a ballot shows up with the same person getting two ballots of knocking one out. I mean, there are safeguards built in, but for Republicans who are only hearing this commentary from their standard bearers, whether it's Larry Elder or still Donald Trump, it's a destructive force in American politics and California politics. And we'll see what happens. I mean, I want to, knock on wood and be optimistic that people aren't going to be spreading that too much. But the fact that Mr. Elder's already been saying it is worrisome, because there is no proof of that. And California has had a pretty good track record. no matter what Republicans nationally have said about conducting elections.
John Myers is the Sacramento bureau chief for the LA Times. He has a lot of typing to do tonight, so we're going to let him get on with it, and we'll hear from him later. And you can read him on the LA Times website tonight and tomorrow, I'm sure, as we get more numbers. And John, thank you again.
Thank you, Pat. Lots of caffeine tonight.
I really appreciate it. The numbers that the LA Times has been putting together, the first numbers after the polls closed in the recall election, 30% of voters voted against recalling Governor Gavin Newsom. 69% voted to keep him. This is with about 40% of the expected vote already counted. We're going to be back with more votes and more numbers and more insights from our experts here at the LA Times, who have been covering this for you for many weeks now and who are bringing their expertise to the fore with the numbers and the analysis. I'm Pat Morrison. Come back and join us in the newsroom pretty soon.